Good morning. I'm David Usher, he, him, and his. And this is a new experience for me to stand up and to start preaching a sermon in front of an empty church. Normally, the church is empty by the time I get to the finish of my sermon. But I'm assuming that this is the start of my new career as a television evangelist, and I'm assuming also there's a 1-800 number below the pulpit as I stand here. I know that today is not a particularly good day for me to invite you to have this image in your head, but if you are a sailor, and if you're not, imagine it's a glorious summer's day, and there's a lovely breeze blowing, and you are out in your own yacht sailing on the bay. And you have invited some of your best friends to come along with you. You have your cooler with a lovely picnic packed. The sparkling wine is chilling. And you've been looking forward to this day for a long time. And finally the day has come. The weather could not be more perfect. And you are out in your yacht sailing on the bay, having the most wonderful time. This is why you bought your boat in the first place. But then as you're sailing along, you notice something in the water and you can't quite make out what it is. But as you get closer and closer, you realize there's some people in the water. And you realize probably what has happened is that their boat has capsized and they are in the water and they are hailing you to stop. What are you going to do? I mean, this is a real dilemma. You've been looking forward to this day for weeks. You've got your best friends on the boat with you. It's a glorious day. You've got the picnic packed in the cooler. You don't want to stop. And if you stop and pull these people out of the water, they're going to be wet and dripping, and then you're going to have to turn around and go straight back into the harbour. They're going to get their wetness all over your beautiful interior of your boat. This is going to be a real nuisance and an inconvenience. What are you going to do? Sail on, stop and help. Well, I mean, it's obvious what you're going to do. Of course it is. You're going to keep sailing. I mean, that's why you got your boat. You didn't get your boat to be the Coast Guard. I mean, obviously you'll do the right thing. You'll ring up the Coast Guard and tell them that there are people who need help. And when you get back home, you'll write a check to the Coast Guard as a token of your appreciation for the work they do, but you want to enjoy yourself. You're here for your own benefit, so you'll sail on. So that reading that Rodney shared about the Good Samaritan, which is one of the most well-known and best-loved parables from the Gospels, the parable of the Good Samaritan. That has been interpreted in so many different ways over the centuries. I remember a number of years ago that celebrated British New Testament scholar Margaret Thatcher interpreted it by saying that this is obviously the whole point of the parable is a vindication of her monetarist economic policies. Seriously, because the Samaritan was able to help the guy who'd been mugged only because he had wine and vinegar, wine and oil in his saddlebags, only because he had a couple of denarii that he could give to the innkeeper. You know, if he hadn't been looking out for himself and making lots of money for himself, he would have never been able to help. That's the whole point of the Good Samaritan, according to Margaret Thatcher. But to be fair to Margaret Thatcher, something which it pains me to do, we all interpret Scripture, we all interpret the world in ways which are most convenient for us, which most suit our existing prejudices. But if it has long been our Unitarian Universalist mantra that if we are to be judged, we want to be judged by our deeds, not by our creeds. Just as a little aside, there was a time in the United Kingdom where you were judged by your creeds. Just to give you a brief history lesson, in the year 1660, the monarchy was restored after the 12 years of Cromwellian parliamentary rule. And in 1662, entirely as an act of political control, they passed the Act of Uniformity, which required all clergy to subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. About 2,000 clergy refused, and they were evicted from their livings and actively persecuted. In 1689, 27 years later, as part of the Glorious Revolution, the Act of Toleration was passed, which decriminalised not subscribing to the 39 Articles. It decriminalised it only for those who continued to espouse Trinitarian doctrine. It remained illegal to be a Unitarian until 1813, when the Unitarian Act was passed, which decriminalised holding a Unitarian theology. There were still many social and civil disabilities, but it was no longer a criminal act. But we're no longer judged by our creeds. We're not held politically, criminally accountable for our creeds. But if we are to be judged by our deeds, what would the evidence be that would convict us? For the last 3+ years, this country has been in crisis. We've been in crisis with a federal administration of a corrupt, cruel, incompetent administration, unparalleled and unprecedented in the history of this country. And many people of faith or no particular faith have been doing all they can to counter and resist the corruption, cruelty, and incompetence of the federal administration. You might recall, back in November, was the second trial of Dr. Scott Warren, who was one of those who was being accused and tried in Arizona for the heinous crime of providing food and shelter to 2 refugees from Central America. That he'd had one trial, the jury could not reach a verdict. There was a second trial, and a call went out to clergy from around the country to please appear at the conclusion of this trial to show that people of faith supported Scott Warren. Well, I had the gift of free time, being retired, and a few air miles, so I answered the call and went down to Tucson. I'm proud to say more than 50% of those clergy from around the country who did reply to that call were Unitarian Universalist clergy. And I was there for the closing arguments. The prosecution put forward the most feeble arguments. You could tell that the prosecutors did not have their heart in it. They were doing it because their political masters had told them they had to. But he was facing up to 20 years imprisonment for the heinous crime of providing food, water, and shelter to 2 people lost in the desert. Well, the jury went out and came back in record time, not guilty. There was great celebration. We were filmed by the local television afterwards, celebrating by singing an Emma's Revolution song. It's on, I believe, local and national television. I've now had my 15 seconds of fame. I still have 14 minutes and plus owing to me. But he was still convicted of the misdemeanor of trespass and littering by going into a reserved area and dropping containers of water. 4 others had also been similarly convicted. But as it turned out, a federal judge overturned those convictions, saying they cannot be found guilty because they were doing what they were doing as acts of faith. What acts of faith might we be called to? In these last 3+ years and before, we Unitarian Universalists and so many others of different faiths and no particular faith have been doing what we can to counter some of the policies of this current administration, helping those who are immigrants, asylum seekers, protesting on behalf of voting rights, LGBTQ rights, the rights of women to reproductive health care, the environment, you name it. But for whatever we have been doing, and God love us for doing it, we have been doing it from a position of privilege. We have gone from our positions of affluence and health and power and economic privilege to do for others who are less fortunate. God love us for doing it. We find ourselves in a new crisis, an unprecedented crisis now, a crisis of the coronavirus, the COVID-19. That is no respecter of persons, it's no respecter of borders. Even politicians and politicians' wives, politicians who until recently have been saying it's all nonsense anyway, film stars are proving themselves susceptible to it. And here's the new paradox. In extolling the virtues and the necessities of community, now, rather than going out into the community to do what we can to help others, our responsibility is to withdraw from the community in physical terms, that self-care now is the same as the social responsibility of not touching others. And that is going to be inconvenient and disruptive, as it was for the Good Samaritan, who didn't just go by, didn't just throw a few denarii and say, "Good luck, fella, but I'm busy, I'm running late for my appointment." The Good Samaritan went out of his way to do what he could for the fellow who'd been mugged. And we're being asked now to do what feels unnatural, not only for our self-care, but for the care of everyone. To withdraw in the paradoxical way, to withdraw in order to show our care for others. So what is the role of faith in doing that? What is the role of our faith in doing that? How do we remain, if we are physically isolated, in touch with others? How do we continue to embrace others with our hearts when we can't embrace them with our arms? There have been two images which have struck me in the last couple of days, struck me because of their disparity. Perhaps you have seen, as I have, clips from Italy, which the whole country has been effectively shut down. People standing on their balconies, singing, playing music, reaching out to provide some beauty to those around that they cannot see. And I have a friend who lives in Barcelona who sent me a clip where last night, at an appointed hour, people went out onto their balconies and applauded doctors, nurses, sanitation workers whose work required them to be in the front line of dealing with this crisis. People, though physically isolated, reaching out with their hearts to those around them to express their love, concern, their care, their sense of solidarity. And then there's been another image, and I have a prop here. Let me tell you, in 40 years or so of preaching, I never imagined I would use this as a prop in a sermon. You know why I'm using this. There has also been footage and reports of people stockpiling, hoarding toilet paper, more toilet paper than they will ever be able to use for years and years and years, getting into fights in the grocery store aisles over toilet paper, because all I care about is me. And I have more than I will ever use, and I don't care that my taking everything means that you have nothing. Which image do you want to hold in your hearts? The image of people singing, playing music from their balconies, applauding those who are doing their utmost to contain this awful virus? Or is this the image that you hold in your heart? The image of greed, self-centeredness, complete unconcern for others. Just to return to the metaphor of a boat. You know, a congregation, if you think of a congregation as a boat, there are different kinds of boats, of course. And different congregations view themselves as different kinds of boats. There are some congregations that you might liken to an ark, whereby the chosen few withdraw onto their ark from the wickedness, the destruction of the world, and only they are safe. And they kind of rejoice in the destruction of everything around them, because that kind of proves how special in the eyes of God they are. There are some congregations which are see themselves more as a lifeboat, that their job is to go out into the choppy seas and rescue those who are floundering, drowning in the storms. There are some congregations which are more like a luxury yacht, whereby a select few are there purely for their own enjoyment, exclusive enjoyment. There are some congregations, and perhaps this is an unfortunate metaphor at the moment, more like a cruise ship, whereby you are with a larger group of people and you pick and choose those entertainments and diversions which might happen to appeal to you, but you're there for your own pleasure with a random selection of other people. What would be the metaphor for this congregation? If this congregation were a boat, what kind of boat would it be? Perhaps there are elements of all. But one of our most guiding principles of the 7 principles is the 7th one, about the independent, us being part of the independent web. And we've tended to think about that in terms of our human relationship with the rest of the natural world, fauna, flora, the environment, and our responsibility to care for that in a lasting way. But the 7th principle also refers to us, the interdependent web of us as human beings, us as being part of a larger community, and our health is dependent upon everybody else's health, and their health is dependent upon mine. So I need to be careful in what I do and how I tend to my own care, because it might be not that I don't dare go out into the world because it might infect me, but because I might infect the world. Our seventh principle about the interdependent web of all existence of which we are part includes at all times our relationships with each other and how we embrace each other with our hearts, even when we cannot embrace each other with our hands. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "We are here to awaken to the illusion of our separateness. We are here to awaken to the illusion of our separateness. There is only one type of boat that can be ours, and that is our blue boat, which we will sail home." Amen.